Officially, it's about 37 minutes flying time from LaGuardia down to Reagan National, and there is Donald Trump's plane now flying into and ready for a landing in Washington, D.C. And onward we go as we taxi down the tarmac. I want to bring in two fascinating and very intelligent human beings here. Chris Wilson, former Ted Cruz campaign pollster and a partner of WPA Opinion Research. And Chris, good morning to you in Washington, D.C. And Arnon Mishkin of Mishkin Associates is the director for the Fox News Decision Desk. And the reason why we brought you two gentlemen on today is not to say, hey, everybody got it so wrong, because in fact, some people were pretty close to the outcome. LA Times tracking poll, if we have that right now, Trump 47, Clinton 44. That was the final day before the vote on Tuesday. Also, another one, IBD had this at Trump 45 and Clinton 43. But gentlemen, I want to know this to the side now, and this is not designed to be critical in any way of pollsters and the jobs they do. No, that's already happened.
Pile on.
I want to know, and Arnon, I'll start with you because you're sitting here. I think the deeper dive in all this is that what have you learned from what the voters told you now that we have the results?
First off, I would say that I'm not certain that the polls you cited as the most accurate were the ones that told us the most about the electorate.
What do you mean?
I think that the other polls, the ones that people are criticizing right now, the ones that showed Clinton in the lead, the ones that showed Clinton at 45, even the last Fox News poll, which had Clinton at 48 and Trump at 44, the 4-point gap, I think those may have been the most informative polls of what was going on in the electorate. If you go into a plain vanilla election and you have plain vanilla candidate who has a few nicks, who's been around, who no one thinks cannot do the job, floating at around 45 points in all the polls, and then you have another candidate who's a maverick, some of whom question whether or not they can do the job, who floats around 38, 40, which is basically what was going on in this election for all the time, that's telling you something. What that's telling you in this, and the outcome of this election reminds us that that's what it was telling us. What that's telling you is the public is not embracing the old established candidate, the Hillary Clinton, who was there floating at 45.
We can concede then, Arnon and Chris, that what you do is as much art as it is science.
Precisely.
Conceded, right? How do you then, Chris, and you tackle this, how do you gauge level of enthusiasm on behalf of the voting public? It seems to me that that's a challenge.
Well, it is, but I would disagree, actually, that it's as much art as it is science. I think it's significantly more science than it is art. If you look at the polls you cited, they were actually wrong. Hillary Clinton won the national popular vote. Where the polls were wrong were in the state-level versions. You look at specifically Pennsylvania, Ohio, I mean really Midwestern states that had a high turnout of whites without a college degree. And what's interesting is they weren't just off. I mean, Donald Trump spoke a lot about polls being off and rigged and whether or not they're making the calls. They weren't just off for Trump. They were off 7.4 points on average in the state that Trump won, but they were still off 3.7 points on average in states that Clinton won. Now, what that gauges, and it gets back to the premise of your question, is how do you measure turnout? And I believe that is where the failures took place. And I can tell you, in the primaries, we learned very, very quickly.
Well, Jim, let me stop you there, because that's the art of polling then. When you're trying, when you're trying to gauge turnout.
Who's going to turn out?
And then you rely on your perhaps your sense of history and knowledge to try and get closer to what the eventual outcome would be, correct?
Well, it's let me go through the systematic approach to it, and I'll do it in as least boring a way as possible. But in the way in which you measure, let's take this universe, the whites without a college degree. And if you recognize that in past elections they made out, let's just say hypothetically 20% of the electorate, and they turned out at a 60% ratio. Well, if through the process of beginning your interviewing that they are beginning to make it through your screener that is supposed to measure turnout, and if you don't, or not too emphatic in your setting your stratifications, and you find that they're making it through at a 65 or even 70% measure, and therefore should make up 22%.
Okay, you're going really deep, my man.
You are, but at that point you adjust for it, and you have to adjust for it, and that's really gets down to it. If you are too rigid about the way in which you build out your stratifications on polling, then yes, you're going to be wrong if enthusiasm changes.
Arnon, I mean, ABC's here, okay? This is not political science on television.
Fair enough. I mean, I think where I disagree with Chris, with all due respect, is that in those states that were so-called off, Michigan and all the rest, it wasn't the stratification or the way you were doing the screener. It was the misreading of the implications of the polls. I looked at Michigan and wondered, why is President Obama flying to Michigan the weekend before an election like this?
He went to Ann Arbor, University of Michigan.
Okay, why is he going there? He was going there because they were looking at polls that had Hillary Clinton at 43. I don't really care where Donald Trump was in that case. If you're looking at a state like Michigan and Hillary Clinton is at 43, you don't need a lot of science to say there's a problem. And I think the polls accurately said there was a problem. What was inaccurate was the media, the analysts, and all the rest, who basically existed in some sort of space where they just couldn't conceive of the fact that Donald Trump could win this election. And they couldn't conceive of the fact that the voters who weren't telling you they were for Clinton were in fact telling you they were not for Clinton.
There are two things there. One is a bias on behalf of the pollsters.
Cognitive dissonance. I think,
and one would be the voter who's saying, I choose to talk to you coming out of the voting booth, or I choose to go on with my day.
That's right. That's right. But I think there was a bias of we weren't listening to them. If you didn't tell us, go ahead.
Got it, Chris. Quickly.
Well, to your point, I do think that's one of the challenges too. Is maybe I don't know if it's a pollster bias, but it's more of a social pressure of the person being interviewed, being unwilling to say. I mean, we definitely found that in the Los Angeles Times poll, is that women were less likely to say they were voting for Trump. You found people were more likely to push a button and say they were voting for Trump through an IVR recorded poll than they were telling a live pollster. Now, and the problem is you've got to have a way. You've got to do it use multimodal. You've got to use IVR. You've got to use live to cells. You've got to do all these things to be able to measure it out accurately. And I think that's the challenge. Is just a strict adherence to one way of doing things rather than looking at everything overall. And that's really what happened to the Michigan example is the Clinton campaign looked at all the data that existed and said, wow, we've got a problem here. We may not be losing today, but undecideds are likely going to break for Donald Trump, and so we need to go there. And so, again, the polling may have underestimated support, but turnout moved in his direction.
And Arnon's agreeing with you on that point. In a lot of these states, gentlemen, we've got to go here, but a lot of these states that were close, they were within the margin of error in the polling.
That's right.
And they were within the margin of error in the outcome for the states that were called. So, gentlemen, thank you. Chris Wilson in Washington, Arnon, Michigan, here in New York.
Thanks, Phil.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.